Good evening. It was a scene right out of an action-packed Hollywood movie. Bloody gun battles between cops and robbers on the streets of suburban Los Angeles today.
He must have fired over 500 rounds. I mean, unbelievable. It was like a war zone, and he just kept doing it. And the cops were all pinned down. One of them was bleeding pretty bad.
The one weapon that we've identified.
These are very organized, brutal bank robbery suspects. They're killers.
Is the story of a bank robbery that went 1997 against almost 400 policemen.
Good evening. Before the sun had even climbed over the palm trees of Los Angeles, before the first morning coffee had even cooled in its cup, the streets of North Hollywood were already trembling under a kind of violence the city had never seen before. It began with a single sound, not a scream, not a siren, but the metallic snap of a rifle charging, and then a thunder that rolled between buildings like a small earthquake. At first, people thought it was a movie shoot. After all, this was Los Angeles. Explosions and gunfire weren't unusual here, but this wasn't a film set. This was real. Two men, dressed like soldiers from some dystopian future, armored from head to toe, faces hidden, rifles modified illegally to fire faster than any police weapon, stepped into the warm morning light like demons entering a quiet church. And within seconds, the quiet became war. Their bullets tore through metal, concrete, glass, and through the calm of an ordinary Friday morning. Cars exploded into flames. Street poles sparked. People dove behind walls, terrified, shaking, whispering prayers they never thought they'd say. Police officers, some barely awake, some still mid-breakfast, arrived with pistols and shotguns, weapons that looked like toys compared to the robbers' battlefield-grade arsenal. No one was prepared. Certainly not the civilians running for their lives. Certainly not the officers pinned behind burning patrol cars. And definitely not the city watching in horror as news helicopters captured the unfolding chaos live, broadcasting what would become one of the most violent urban shootouts in American history. In the middle of Los Angeles, on a warm February morning, two men were about to hold off almost 400 cops, including SWAT, for nearly an hour. Their mission? Steal money, spread terror, and maybe die doing it. Who were these men? Where did they come from? And what brings two ordinary gym buddies to become the masterminds behind a firefight so intense it changed policing in America forever? To understand the madness that exploded on February 28, 1997, we have to go back. Before the guns, before the chaos, before the streets became a battlefield. We have to go back to a time when Los Angeles earned a title no city ever wants, the bank robbery capital of America. This is the story of the North Hollywood Shootout. A true event so extreme, so cinematic, so unreal, that even Hollywood couldn't have written it better. Los Angeles, a city where dreams were born, broken, rebuilt, and sometimes drowned in blood. Before the morning of the North Hollywood Shootout, before the bullets rained onto asphalt like metallic hail, before two men turned a quiet suburban street into a war zone, the city had already been brewing something dark for decades. A silent pressure, a tension under the concrete, a shadow stretching through its bright palm-lined boulevards. Because Los Angeles, long before Hollywood gave it glamour, had earned a very different title, one no city wanted, the bank robbery capital of America. And it didn't earn that title by accident. The rise of the new outlaw era. In the 1930s, America faced the Great Depression, a catastrophe that pushed ordinary people into desperate corners. Back then, outlaws like John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde became legends. They were criminals, yes, but romanticized ones. folk anti-heroes, rebels, gangsters who robbed banks with smooth-talking charm and a twisted sense of theatrics. But that era eventually faded. By the 1950s and 60s, bank robberies were rare. Small, sloppy, usually driven by amateurs who needed quick cash, not men with military-grade armor. But history has a strange way of circling back, because by the late 60s, something started creeping into Los Angeles again. A new breed of criminals, a new generation of outlaws, angrier, hungrier, and far more violent. By 1970, Los Angeles recorded 3,500 plus robberies a year. By 1980, that number climbed to nearly 6,000. By 1990, the golden age of LA crime, it reached 7,900 plus. That meant one robbery almost every hour, 7 robberies every single day. Every bank in LA was a target, all the time. And that wasn't the worst part. These weren't the gentlemen outlaws of the 1930s. These were kids, teenagers, gangs, desperate criminals with cheap weapons and unstable behavior, and one man escalated it into madness. The baby bandits, when teenagers declared war. His name was Robert Sheldon Casper Brown, a ruthless, charismatic, cold-blooded member of the Crips gang, a man who had never seen bank robbery as a job, but as a strategy, an industry, a money factory. When he learned that a pair of polite professional robbers, the West Hills Bandits, had stolen $437,000 from a Los Angeles bank in minutes, Casper had an idea, a dark, twisted idea. If 2 men could steal nearly $500,000, why not build an army? And so he did. Within months, Casper started recruiting teenagers, some as young as 13 years old, training them, arming them, and unleashing them on LA banks. They stormed into branches wearing gang colors, cheap masks, often high on drugs, firing AKs into the ceiling without warning. They weren't smooth, they weren't smart, they weren't even stable. They were chaos. These baby bandits, as the FBI later called them, terrorized customers, pistol-whipped tellers, fired randomly, and hurt people without reason. They robbed 175-plus banks, more than any individual in U.S. history, and Casper never had to step foot inside any branch. Crime wasn't spreading, it was multiplying, and Los Angeles was drowning in it. But while teenage gangs created chaos, a different kind of threat was rising quietly in the corner of a gym in Venice Beach. 2 men who weren't interested in small robberies. 2 men who didn't want fast money, they wanted war. 2 men who looked at bank robbery the same way a soldier might study a battlefield. Their names would soon be burned into the memory of an entire nation. Larry Phillips Jr., Emil Matassarianu. But before the bullets, before the armor, before the hour-long shootout, they were just 2 broken boys carrying different wounds, but walking toward the same violent destiny. 2 childhoods that created monsters. 2 men born thousands of miles apart, yet shaped by trauma in hauntingly similar ways. Larry Phillips Jr., born September 20th, 1970, Los Angeles County, Mexican-Italian descent. He didn't grow up in a loving home. His father, Larry Phillips Sr., was constantly in trouble with the law. Arrests, criminal charges, police raids. The boy grew up watching guns drawn on his father, watching officers slam him to the ground, watching violence as the background music of his childhood. According to his father, Larry's hatred for police began on his 6th birthday, when the FBI stormed their home, guns raised, shouting orders, arresting his father in front of him. A child learns what he sees, and Larry learned hate. He learned that the world had enemies, and that the biggest enemy wore a badge. He dropped out of school at 13. He stole his first suits at 19. He studied crime the way other children studied math. And most dangerously, he loved guns, not just as weapons, but as extensions of power. His half-brother later said, Larry wanted 2 things, money and power, and he didn't care what he had to do to get them. Then there was Emil, born July 19th, 1966, in Timișoara, Romania, an immigrant child, overweight, mocked for his accent, socially isolated, angry, depressed. Kids laughed at him, bullied him, called him names he never forgot. And at home, his parents constantly fought, shouting matches that filled the house with tension. Lonely and angry, Emil found comfort in two things: computers' guns. He cleaned guns on his porch. Neighbors saw him sitting there for hours, methodically wiping each piece of metal like it was therapy. By adulthood, Emil had a temper that frightened everyone, including himself. Once he threw a chainsaw at a neighbor just because their dog walked across his lawn. He was unraveling. And then both men found the one place that made them feel powerful: Gold's Gym, Venice Beach, the birthplace of American bodybuilding, the home of giants, the Temple of Iron, Gold's Gym, where violence found muscle. This is where the story turns dark, because in 1989, two men walked into a gym searching for strength and walked out with something far more dangerous: a partnership built on anger, ego, and obsession. Larry, disciplined, cold, obsessive, manipulative. Emil, insecure, emotional, looking for leadership. Opposites, but opposites that clicked. Larry became the alpha. Emil became the follower. According to Larry's own half-brother, Larry would break your mind and rebuild you. Emil became whatever Larry wanted him to be. They lifted together, ate together, talked about guns, crime, money, studied robberies like soldiers studying military strategy. They watched Heat 1995, not once, but repeatedly. They weren't inspired by the movie. They were learning from it. They dreamed bigger, darker, more violent. And soon they would put their dreams into action. Los Angeles had created criminals before, but nothing like these two, because Larry and Emil weren't trying to escape police. They weren't trying to avoid violence. They wanted war. They wanted confrontation. They wanted domination. They wanted to prove that two men with enough firepower could take on an entire city. They wanted to rewrite history. And on October 23rd, 1993, they made their first move. The first red flag. It was just after noon when a Glendale police sergeant named Ian Grimes noticed something strange. A red Ford Thunderbird, speeding, changing lanes aggressively, tinted windows. Two large men in the front seats who didn't look like they were in any kind of hurry, except the dangerous kind. Grimes pulled them over. What happened next wasn't a high-speed chase. It wasn't a shootout. It wasn't dramatic. It was something much simpler, but much more revealing. The officer approached the window. Larry was in the driver's seat, Emil in the passenger's. "Where you boys headed?" Grimes asked. Larry hesitated. That alone made the officer suspicious. Then Emil spoke and made everything worse. "It's Larry's mother's car," he blurted. Except the car wasn't Larry's mother's. They had rented it from the airport. Officer Grimes had already run the plates. He already knew. A lie, a bad one, an unnecessary one. That's when Grimes asked Larry to step out of the car. Routine, simple, calm. He patted him down and felt cold metal under the clothes. A gun. Now Grimes knew something was wrong. Something big. Backup arrived. When officers opened the trunk of the Thunderbird, what they found looked less like criminal equipment and more like someone planning a small war. Assault rifles, machine guns, homemade suppressors, smoke bombs, explosive devices, bulletproof vests, tactical gear, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. It was a mobile armory. Enough firepower to attack a building or defend one against a small army. These weren't robbers trying to get rich. These were men preparing for violent conflict. But here's where the story shifts into something almost unbelievable. Despite the arsenal, despite the ammunition, despite the explosives, Larry and Emil were not charged with anything major. Police could only prove conspiracy to commit robbery, a minor charge, a technical violation. The two men spent 100 days in jail. That's it, 100 days. And when they walked free, they walked out with most of their arsenal returned to them, because legally none of the weapons could be tied to an actual crime. It was the first and biggest warning sign Los Angeles would fail to see, because those weapons, those vests, those rifles, they weren't for intimidation, they weren't for show, they were for the next chapter, a much darker chapter. The first kill, June 14, 1995, just after 12:25 p.m. A Brinks armored truck parked outside a restaurant in the Wilshire district. Two guards stepped out, both middle-aged, both seasoned, both experienced enough to know danger when they saw it. But danger didn't give them a chance. Larry and Emil, wearing hoods, body armor, and carrying illegally modified rifles, opened fire without warning, without negotiation, without threats, without a word. Herman Cook, a 51-year-old father of two, was hit multiple times. He died instantly, not because he resisted, not because he reached for a weapon, not because he posed any threat. He died because Larry and Emil had already crossed a line few criminals ever cross. They had embraced murder, cold-blooded, efficient, indifferent. The two men fled with $122,000, not because they needed the money, but because the robbery was a test. They wanted to see how it felt, how fast they could move, how much power they had, how the armor protected them, how the rifles pierced metal. It was practice, a rehearsal, a warm-up for something bigger. They were perfecting the art of war in a city unprepared for soldiers. A failed robbery and a lesson learned 9 months later, March the 27th, 1996. Larry and Emil targeted another armored truck. This time they tried something different, a drive-by attack. But things didn't go as planned. Larry fired through the windshield of their van into the Brinks truck passing them. Glass flew, metal shattered, but the drivers managed to keep going. The robbers chased them, but lost them in traffic. This was their first big failure. Enraged, they burned their getaway vehicle to destroy evidence, just like the criminals did in the movie Heat. But a failure for normal criminals is discouragement. For Larry and Emil, it was homework. They studied what went wrong: timing, angle, firepower, spacing, car positioning, guard reactions, police response times. Most people fail and quit. These two failed and evolved, and their evolution led them to the next phase: bank robberies. Not the chaotic teenage-style ones, not the panicked, drug-fueled madness of Casper's baby bandits. No, Larry and Emil's robberies would be strategic, military-style assaults. The Bank of America robberies, May the 2nd, 1996. Venice, Los Angeles, 10 a.m. Larry and Emil stormed into the Bank of America branch like soldiers entering a war zone. One carried a Norinco Type 56, a Chinese AK-47 variant. The other carried a Romanian AIM assault rifle. Both carried hundreds of rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. The first thing they did, fire into the ceiling. A dozen rounds, shells raining onto terrified customers, screams filling the air. Inside the bank were 30 hostages, including young children, and the robbers treated them with the same cruelty they treated their victims on the street. A crying child angered Emil. He pointed his rifle and said, "Make him shut up, or I'll shut him up myself." A 79-year-old woman moved too slowly. Emil struck her in the back of the head with his rifle butt. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't nervous. He was enjoying the power. Inside the vault, Emil grew furious when he realized the bank only had $300,000 on hand, far less than the $750,000 they expected. So he fired into the ceiling again, enraged, as if the bullets could magically produce more money. But they still left with $755,000. A huge haul, a massive success, a victory, and exactly like Heat, they did it in under 6 minutes. But the second robbery would be even bigger. May 31st, 1996. Their second bank robbery, 10:05 a.m. Same method, same coldness, same brutality, more gunfire, more screams, more violence. But this time they shot 2 bank tellers, left them bleeding on the floor. They stole $794,000. In just 30 days, the duo stole nearly $1.5 million in cash, But the police learned something too, and what they learned terrified them. These robbers didn't run, they didn't rush, they didn't panic. They moved slow, methodical, as if they wanted the police to arrive, as if they wanted a fight, as if the money wasn't the goal, but the confrontation was. Agents reviewing the security footage noticed the same thing. They walk like men who don't fear consequences. And consequences were coming, because in just 9 months they would return to another Bank of America, this time in North Hollywood. And instead of 6 minutes, this robbery would last almost an hour. Instead of 2 tellers injured, nearly 20 civilians and officers would be shot. Instead of stealing money, they would trigger one of the biggest gun battles in US history. Los Angeles had seen thousands of robberies, but nothing, absolutely nothing, would compare to what was coming. The city didn't know it yet, but the countdown to February 28, 1997 had already begun. The evolution of a partnership. Larry and Emil were never equal. Larry was the leader, the planner, the brain, the manipulator. Emil was the follower, the admirer, the muscle that listened, the man who wanted someone to tell him what to be. Their friendship wasn't built on loyalty, it was built on control. Former acquaintances said the same thing. Larry broke Emil down, then rebuilt him in his own image. And Larry loved having control over people. He had failed as a bodybuilder, failed as a real estate scammer, failed in college, failed in marriage. But here, with one man under his influence, he finally felt powerful. And a man who feels powerful without having earned it is always dangerous. Why they wanted. War people commit robberies for money. Larry and Emil did too, at first. But after months of training, preparation, and violence, something changed. They began to crave the adrenaline more than the money. They weren't trying to get rich. They were preparing for something monumental, something suicidal, something that would make them feel like legends. It all traced back to Heat, the movie they watched over and over again. A team of armored, disciplined, calm criminals facing off against an entire police force. Gunfire exploding across downtown Los Angeles. Larry didn't just enjoy the movie. He studied it, paused scenes, rewound moments, analyzed weapon stances, calculated police response times, practiced movement patterns. Heat wasn't entertainment for him. It was a training video. His apartment would later be found with a VHS copy of the movie, worn out from replaying. He wasn't fantasizing. He was planning. The stockpile of a madman. Weapons were their religion. Every dollar they stole went into guns, armor, ammunition, and modifications. They didn't just buy weapons, they upgraded them illegally. Fully automatic conversions, high-capacity magazines, homemade steel plating, custom-cut ballistic body armor, drum magazines, Teflon-coated rounds, armor-piercing ammunition. Police had pistols and shotguns. Larry and Emil had weapons designed for battlefields. Neighbors often saw them, carrying duffel bags in and out, welding metal armor plates in the garage, firing illegally modified rifles in remote desert areas, training with military precision, practicing reload drills for hours, rehearsing movements like soldiers, not thieves. They didn't want to just rob banks. They wanted to overwhelm the police. Emil's breaking point. Through all this, Emil's life was falling apart. His marriage was strained. He felt like an outsider in America. His business failed. He was mocked for his accent. He didn't fit in anywhere. Larry was the only person who made him feel strong. And when a man with insecurity finds a leader with confidence, he becomes willing to follow them anywhere, even into suicidal violence. Larry filled Emil with twisted ideas. The world is against you. The police are the enemy. Society doesn't want you to rise. The only way to win is to force the world to fear you. Violence is power, money is respect, armor makes you invincible. In time, Emil began to believe it all. He started training harder, shooting more often, studying the same criminal films Larry idolized. He wasn't just following orders now, he was embracing the madness. The police miscalculation. After their two massive bank robberies in 1996, the police had surveillance footage. They could see two very large men walking, slowly, confidently, deliberately, fully armed, fully armored. The FBI studied the tapes. One agent made a note. These men move like they want to fight. But here was the problem. Los Angeles had too many bank robbers. The city average was 7 bank robberies per day. That year, more than 2,000 robberies happened in LA County alone, and Larry and Emil were just two shadows among hundreds. The police misread the danger. They saw robbers. They didn't see soldiers. Training for battle. By late 1996, Larry and Emil were in full preparation mode. They trained every week in open desert areas, Nevada, San Bernardino, remote California valleys. They practiced suppressive fire, rapid magazine changes, coordinated movement, shoulder-to-shoulder firing, clearing rooms, entering buildings with rifles up, switching from automatic to semi-automatic firing while walking, aiming with armored gloves, wearing weighted gear for hours. They also used their armor to simulate police gunfire. Larry would fire at Emil's vest while Emil stood against trees or sand dunes, testing the strength of metal plates. Bullet dents scattered across their gear showed just how many times they practiced. The armor didn't just protect them, it empowered them, gave them confidence, turned them into something dangerous, something reckless. The psychological transformation. Larry developed a hatred toward police from childhood. He believed every cop was corrupt. Every cop was the enemy. Emil eventually adopted the same belief. This transformation can be summarized in one truth. They didn't fear death. They feared being ordinary, and that made them unpredictable. They weren't planning an escape. They were planning a spectacle, a standoff so intense, so terrifying, so unprecedented that the world would remember them. The last week. In the final week before the North Hollywood shootout, both men behaved strangely. They withdrew money from their accounts, paid off small debts, bought extra ammunition, purchased new ballistic plates, stockpiled prescription tranquilizers. They visited gun ranges more often, went to the gym for the last time. One neighbor recalled seeing Larry laughing loudly in his driveway, a man preparing for something significant. Another neighbor saw Emil sitting alone in his car at night, engine off, staring into the darkness for hours. Their final interactions with friends were cold, distant, almost like goodbyes, because they knew. They knew what February 28th would be. Not another robbery, not another practice run, but the final act. The night before. On the night before the shooting, the two men met secretly. They went through their equipment one last time. Weapons armor, extra magazines, gloves, clothes, bank layout, police response patterns, escape routes, radio frequencies. They swallowed prescription sedatives to keep calm when the shooting began, to slow their heart rate, to make them feel invincible. They loaded magazine after magazine, tested armor straps, checked rifle barrels, rehearsed the 8-minute operation. They believed they could get in and out before the police arrived. But deep down, Larry knew something else. He didn't care if they escaped. He wanted the confrontation, the war, the moment that would define his life. The morning of the attack. At dawn, they suited up, layer after layer of armor, groin, chest, back, shins, arms, shoulders. They weren't dressing like robbers. They were dressing like infantry soldiers. Larry looked at himself in the mirror, a massive silhouette covered in steel. A walking weapon. Emil's hands shook slightly as he zipped his vest, the tranquilizers beginning to slow his nerves. They grabbed their rifles, loaded the magazines, started the engine of their white Chevrolet. The streets were quiet. The sky was brightening. People were going to work. Children were waiting for school buses. A normal morning, but not for them. This was their moment, their final chapter. At 9:17 a.m., they stepped out of their car and began the most violent police shootout in American history. February 28, 1997, North Hollywood, 9:17 a.m. What began as just another quiet Friday morning would soon erupt into a war zone so violent, so chaotic, so unbelievable that even experienced officers later admitted it felt like a battlefield in a foreign country. The first steps into hell. Larry Phillips Jr. stepped out of the white Chevrolet first. His armored body glinted under the California sun. He moved with the slow, heavy confidence of a man who believed he couldn't be killed. Behind him was Emil, quieter, heavier, sweating under the metal plate strapped to his body, but holding a rifle with the grip of someone ready for violence. Their armor wasn't store-bought, it was homemade, welded, cut by hand, layered in steel plates that covered nearly every inch of their bodies from neck to ankle. They weren't robbers, they were tanks, walking, breathing, metal. Larry checked his illegally modified Norinco rifle. It was ready to fire at full auto, 10 bullets per second. He looked at Emil, a small nod, the last nod they would ever share. Inside the bank, Larry entered first, pointing his rifle at a customer near the door. Inside, now. Civilians froze. Some screamed, some dropped to the ground. Then, without hesitation, bam, 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 bam. Larry fired into the ceiling. A dozen rounds exploded into plaster. Sparks fell. Pieces of tile rained down on screaming customers. Anyone who wasn't on the floor now dove for cover. Inside the vault, Emil was already furious. They had expected $750,000. They got barely half. Stack after stack of cash was missing, already picked up for armored transport. His breathing grew louder, faster. He swung his rifle and struck the deputy manager in the back of the head, a brutal hit that echoed. In the small vault room, "This can't be all," Emil screamed. "It is! It's all we have!" the terrified manager yelled. Emil fired into the ceiling. More sparks, more screaming. They knew the clock was ticking, but they didn't realize. Police were already outside. The first response officer, Loren Farrell, and his partner, Martin Perello, were only meters away when they saw the two heavily armored figures enter the bank. They didn't hesitate. "Possible 211 in progress," Farrell radioed in. "Suspects heavily armed, possible AK-47s. Within minutes, multiple LAPD units arrived. 4, 6, 10. Every officer took cover behind their patrol cars, but they were about to discover something terrifying. A police car is not cover when the enemy has armor-piercing ammunition. The doors open, 9:24 a.m. The robbery had lasted barely 7 minutes, but the entire street outside was filled with police. Larry stepped out first. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply stepped into the sunlight, raised his rifle, and boot! A monstrous full auto burst shook the entire street. Shards of metal flew from parked cars. Headlights exploded. Bullet holes punched straight through both sides of vehicles. Officers ducked, rolling behind engines. Even engines weren't safe. Armor-piercing rounds tore through them like butter. It sounded like a machine gun nest from Vietnam, not a Los Angeles street. Civilians screamed, some fainted, others crouched behind trees, walls, dumpsters, anything. The bullets didn't care. They went through everything. The police realized the horrifying truth, officer. Farrell peeked over the hood of his patrol car, only to watch a bullet rip through the metal and explode out the other side. He dove down instantly. "They're shooting through our cars. We need heavier weapons," he screamed over the radio. But the LAPD didn't have heavier weapons. At that time, police carried 9mm pistols, 38 revolvers, 12-gauge shotguns against AK-47s firing armor-piercing ammunition. The officers were outmatched, outgunned, out-armored, out-everything. One officer later said, "We brought handguns to a machine gun fight." The Devil's Symphony. When Emil emerged with the money bag, the sound doubled. 2 rifles, 2 machines of death, 2 demons in body armor unleashing hell. Officer John Caparelli described it. It was like 2 lawnmowers made of metal and fire, a sound you never forget. Bullets ricocheted off concrete. Glass exploded. A bus stop shattered into pieces. A woman across the street was hit in the leg while running with her child. Another civilian took a bullet to the shoulder while trying to drag an older man into a store. The chaos was biblical. Screams, smoke, gunfire, sirens, helicopters, and through it all, Larry walked calmly, almost casually, as if enjoying the destruction. The unstoppable robbers, the police, tried everything. One officer fired at Larry from about 200 meters away, a brave but nearly hopeless attempt. The bullet hit Larry in the back. Everyone held their breath. Larry staggered, then turned around. Not dead, not injured, just angry. He raised his rifle and unleashed a furious burst, hitting two officers, shattering one man's femur. This changed everything. The police realized, we can shoot them, but it doesn't matter. Ink pack detonates. Emil carried the bag of cash towards their getaway car. Suddenly, boom! The anti-theft die pack exploded. Red ink flew everywhere. Every dollar bill inside the bag turned bright red. Useless, unspendable, ruined. Emil stared at the ruined money, a look of pure frustration on his face. Their entire plan had just collapsed. Now they had no money, no exit, no reason to flee. Just one thing left: violence, shooting at the helicopters. For the first time in American history, a criminal on the ground shot at news helicopters in mid-air. "We're being shot at! We're being shot at!" the pilot screamed live on air. Helicopters swerved out of the way. Viewers at home gasped. This wasn't a movie. This was live TV. Emil begins to fall apart. Emil's body was starting to fail him. A bullet tore off a chunk of his eyebrow. Blood trickled down his face. He stumbled into the car, breathing heavily, disoriented. His vest had protected him, but the shock, the blood loss, the heat under the armor, it was all catching up. From inside the car, he watched Larry continue firing like a man possessed. For the first time, Emil realized Larry doesn't want to leave. Larry wants to die here. The argument, "Let's get out of here." Emil tried to get Larry's attention. He leaned over the passenger seat, opened the door, waved him over. "Come on, let's go," he shouted. Larry looked at him and closed the car door with his hip. He didn't want to run. He wanted more gunfire, more confrontation, more power. This wasn't a robbery anymore. For Larry, this was his war. Larry's last stand. Larry's rifle jammed, the nightmare of any gunman. He retreated behind a truck, kneeled down, tried clearing the chamber. A brave officer took the shot, hit Larry in the collarbone. Blood sprayed across his armored chest. Larry roared in pain. He grabbed his backup gun, a Beretta 92F. Before he could fire more, bang! A police bullet hit his hand. His pistol flew. He grabbed it off the ground, lifted it toward his chin, and bang! He pulled the trigger. 9:56 a.m. Larry Phillips Jr. was dead. Emil alone. Emil didn't know yet. He sat in the Chevrolet, bleeding heavily, trying repeatedly to start the engine. It wouldn't start. The driver had activated the kill switch. Panicked, Emil stumbled from the car, trying to hijack another vehicle. The first attempt failed. The second attempt failed. He saw Larry's body 3 blocks away. He tapped his chest twice, a final salute. Then he ran. The final stand. SWAT arrives. Emil finally managed to hijack a pickup truck, but couldn't start it. When he tried again, a SWAT armored vehicle screeched to a stop directly in front of him. He stepped out of the stolen truck, moved to the rear of his original car, took a firing stance, readied himself. Now the battle was equal, SWAT rifles versus Emil's AK. The air exploded with gunfire. SWAT hit his arms, his chest, his shoulder. His armor absorbed at the first hits, but then SWAT officers realized his legs were unprotected. They aimed lower. Bullets tore through his thighs, through his calves, through his knees. Blood poured onto the pavement. Emil collapsed, still holding his rifle, still trying to fire, still cursing the officers, still enraged. He was hit 29 times. The officers handcuffed him. He hissed through his teeth, "Shoot me in the head, just do it." Minutes later, before the ambulance arrived, Emil bled out on the sidewalk. 10:01 a.m. The nightmare was over. Hollywood Shootout. The war in the streets of Los Angeles ended in just 44 minutes, but its consequences would echo for decades. Police cars were shredded. Storefronts looked like they'd been attacked with machine guns. Civilians who had come out just to buy groceries now sat trembling behind ambulances, hands shaking, clothes soaked with blood, theirs or someone else's. For hours, North Hollywood resembled a battlefield, and when the gunfire finally stopped, 2 bodies lay motionless on the asphalt. The men who had turned a bank robbery into one of the most violent gunfights in modern American history. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu. But the story didn't end with their deaths. In many ways, it was only the beginning. A city in shock. As the haze of gunpowder drifted through the air, residents slowly emerged from behind cars, trash bins, and store shelves. Parents clutched crying children. Older men who had lived through real wars whispered, "I never thought I'd hear those sounds again." The LAPD began securing the area, moving carefully between hundreds of bullet casings scattered like metallic seeds across the pavement. Some officers broke down in tears, others vomited from adrenaline shock. Even the toughest veterans admitted the truth. We were completely outgunned, not outnumbered, outgunned, and the whole country had watched it live, counting the wounded. When ambulances finally reached the victims, the numbers were staggering. 8 civilians wounded, 12 police officers wounded, 2 critically, 12 LAPD vehicles destroyed, 85 civilian cars hit by bullets, but incredibly, not a single innocent person died. Given the firepower used, it seemed impossible. Miraculous, even. One officer said, "God held his hand over this neighborhood today." Larry and Emil, what was their real plan? Investigators took a long look at the bodies of Larry and Emil, their armor, their weapons, their ammunition, their modified rifles, their homemade steel plates, and one question haunted everyone. What were they planning? Because nothing about their equipment said robbery. Everything about it said war. They carried full auto-converted AK-47s, thousands of rounds, homemade armor, metal plates, drum magazines, armor-piercing ammunition, police scanners, smoke bombs, vehicle-killing rounds. Investigators slowly realized something chilling. Larry and Emil didn't just prepare for trouble. They prepared to outfight the entire LAPD. Some detectives whispered darker theories. Maybe the money didn't matter. Maybe the robbery was bait. Maybe they wanted the gunfight, the ultimate showdown. A self-destructive fantasy built on hatred of authority and obsession with guns. There's no way to know for sure. Both men died before they could explain themselves. Inside the homes of the robbers, police raided Larry and Emil's residences later that day. What they found was disturbing. More weapons, more homemade armor, ammunition stashes, explosives, tactical gear, cut-up metal plates, drills, and tools for modifying rifles, manuals on evading law enforcement, bags containing stolen cash from previous heists, and most chilling, a VHS tape of the movie Heat. Detectives stared at the tape. For months, some investigators had suspected that Larry and Emil were copying the tactics from Michael Mann's iconic film. Now the truth was undeniable. They were inspired by a movie, and they took the fantasy into real life. Heat's main robbery scene looked uncannily similar to what happened on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, down to the slow, deliberate walking with rifles. But unlike the movie, this wasn't fiction. This wasn't glamorous. This was carnage, the unrecovered money, a missing fortune. The robberies Larry and Emil committed before North Hollywood totaled $1.5 million. That money never reappeared. Police searched homes, cars, apartments, garages, storage units, banks, yards, basements. Nothing. Where did the money go? Did they hide it, burn it, send it overseas, spend it secretly? No one knows. The cash remains one of the great unanswered mysteries of the case. Why did they keep fighting, even with ruined money, even with police everywhere, even with armor failing, even with bullets tearing through their bodies? Why didn't they surrender? Why didn't they run? Psychologists studying the case suggested multiple theories. One, suicide by cop Larry's final moment when he raised the gun to his chin strongly suggests he did not intend to survive the day. Two, addiction to violence. Years of weapons obsession, bodybuilding, and delusion could have built a fantasy they were determined to live out, even if it meant death. 3. Hatred of authority. Larry's lifelong resentment of police, encouraged by his father, may have turned the robbery into an opportunity for revenge. 4. Fear of prison. Both men had previously served time. They knew, if caught this time, the sentence would be life. 5. Adrenaline, plus tranquilizers. Both had taken muscle relaxants before the robbery. Their sense of pain, danger, and rationality was impaired. The result? A suicidal, unstoppable last stand. SWAT's shock. We could have died today. The SWAT team that confronted Emil later said, "We expected to fight. We didn't expect a war." For the first time, LAPD officers were staring at someone who fired back with equal firepower. That moment changed American policing forever. Before the shootout, most officers carried pistols, revolvers, shotguns. After North Hollywood, patrol rifles became standard, hard-plate body armor increased, training changed, police response doctrine was rewritten. A single 44-minute gunfight changed the equipment of every police department in the United States. Experts still refer to it as the day American law enforcement entered the modern era. The lawsuit, Emil's mother speaks. One of the most controversial parts of the aftermath came from Emil's mother. She filed a lawsuit against LAPD. She claimed police allowed her son to bleed out. Officers denied him medical attention. SWAT unfairly targeted his legs. The lawsuit shocked the country. Many found it offensive. Others argued medical ethics should apply, even to criminals. After a heated legal battle, the court ruled in favor of the LAPD. Emil's own actions created the deadly situation, and officers were not required to risk their lives entering a live fire zone to give him aid. The case was closed, but the controversy lingered, the public reaction, horror and fascination. When news stations replayed the footage that night, millions of Americans sat in stunned silence. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Two men in homemade armor, marching casually through a Los Angeles neighborhood, shooting at civilians, police and helicopters, in broad daylight, on live television. It felt surreal, like something out of a video game like GTA or a military movie. Experts compared it to Mogadishu, Bosnia, early Iraq war combat. But this wasn't war, this was America, and that made it even more terrifying. The impact on pop culture. The shootout became legendary. It inspired TV shows, Hollywood films, documentaries, news specials, police training modules, even video games referenced it. Some criminals even copied it, though none ever matched the level of violence. But underneath the fascination was a darker truth. People weren't inspired by Larry and Emil. They were horrified by them. The two gunmen became symbols of high-risk weapon obsession, anti-police extremism, the danger of unregulated firearms, the arrogance of delusion, the collapse of moral boundaries. Their story shows how two ordinary men can fall into extraordinary darkness. Neighborhood forever marked. For months after the shootout, Laurel Canyon Boulevard still bore the scars: bullet holes in walls, broken street signs, damaged concrete, permanently dented metal, shattered business windows. Even years later, people would walk past those scars and remember the sound of gunfire echoing across the street. Some could never unhear it. One store owner said, "Every time I hear a loud bang, I duck. It's automatic now." The final judgment. History has already judged Larry and Emil. not as folk heroes, not as masterminds, not as Robin Hood thieves, but as two violent men who turned their resentment, arrogance, and fantasies into a tragedy. Their final act didn't make them legends. It made them warnings. Warnings about unchecked anger, obsession with power, fascination with violence, the desire to feel invincible, and how quickly a life can spiral into darkness. Their deaths closed one chapter, but opened another. A chapter for police reform, a chapter for public understanding, a chapter for better law enforcement equipment and tactics. The North Hollywood shootout remains a grim reminder. When two men try to play war in a peaceful city, the results are catastrophic. Shadows over North Hollywood. For hours after the gunfire ceased, the streets of North Hollywood felt strangely silent. Not peaceful, not relieved, but hollow. As if the neighborhood itself was trying to understand what had just happened. A father carried his daughter out of a grocery store, her small hands pressed tightly over her ears. A store clerk swept broken glass from her entrance, hands shaking. Old men whispered about Vietnam, about Sarajevo, about Mogadishu, never imagining they would see similar violence on American soil. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. The pavement was coated in bullet casings that glittered like brass scars under the sun. Police tape waved gently in the breeze. Fire engines idled beside ruined vehicles. Helicopters had finally gone quiet. But the echoes of that morning would never truly disappear. A nation watches the replay. That evening, millions of Americans sat glued to their televisions. They watched Larry calmly marching through the street, Emil firing blindly from behind the car, officers diving behind cars that offered no protection, civilians running for their lives, the helicopter shaking as bullets ripped through the sky. The footage replayed again and again, slow motion, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame. The nation watched in disbelief and fear. People asked, how is this possible? How did two men nearly defeat an entire police force? What if they had killed dozens? In a country that prided itself on law enforcement strength, it was a moment of reckoning. A moment that forced America to admit the danger wasn't always out there. Sometimes it lived right here, in our own neighborhoods. Behind the armor, two men lost in their own delusion. When investigators laid out Larry and Emil's gear on large evidence tables, it looked like equipment seized from a military base, not from two suburban criminals. Rows of magazines, full auto rifles, ballistic plates, ammunition belts, homemade armor, tactical pouches, customized firearm parts. It was chilling. These weren't desperate men stealing for survival. They weren't victims of poverty. They weren't masterminds trying to outwit the system. They were something far more dangerous. Two ordinary men who convinced themselves they were extraordinary. Two men who believed armor made them invincible weapons, made them powerful anger, made them righteous bullets, made them gods. They forged their own myth, brick by brick, bullet by bullet, until they lived inside it. And that myth collapsed violently on one Los Angeles morning. The officers who stood their ground. The LAPD officers who responded that day were neither soldiers nor superheroes. They were regular men and women who drank their morning coffee, checked their patrol routes, and expected a normal shift. But when the bullets began to fly, those same officers made a choice, a hard, terrifying choice: stand their ground or watch civilians die. They took cover behind cars that weren't truly cover. They fired pistols at men wearing steel plates. They dragged wounded civilians out of the line of fire. They held their positions even as bullets ripped through their radios, their tires, their windshields. One officer later said, "I wasn't brave, I was scared out of my mind, but people were counting on us." For all the chaos of that morning, one truth remained clear. If the police hadn't stood their ground, North Hollywood would have experienced a massacre. The SWAT confrontation, courage at 10 meters, the final confrontation, 10 meters of asphalt separating Emil from 7 SWAT officers, has been studied by police academies for over 2 decades. Why? because those 10 meters were the difference between life and death. 10 meters between. A desperate man bleeding out officers who had never faced a gunman with such armor rifles firing full auto exploding glass, panicking civilians, a city holding its breath. When SWAT identified Emil's unprotected legs, they aimed low. They fired with precision, and they ended the fight in seconds. Without those few seconds of courage and clarity, Emil might have escaped again, maybe taken a hostage, maybe reached a school block, maybe anything, but he didn't. Because those officers closed the distance, because they made the right call, because training met instinct and instinct met duty. That moment remains one of the most intense recorded firefight endings in modern policing. The world takes notice. In the months that followed, police departments across America changed overnight. Patrol cars began carrying AR-15 rifles stronger, Kevlar armor, heavy plates, breaching tools, improved radios, ballistic shields. Training changed, tactics changed, policy changed. Some called it an arms race, others called it necessary. But everyone agreed, after North Hollywood, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. The human cost, invisible scars. The shootout left more than physical wounds. Psychologists later interviewed dozens of civilians. A shopkeeper who dove under her counter still woke up at night hearing gunfire. A teenage boy who watched bullets tear through his parents' car struggled with trauma for years. Officers who fought that day quietly battled guilt, fear, and flashbacks, the price of bravery. One officer admitted, "I used to think PTSD was a military thing. Now I understand it isn't. Trauma does not choose its victims. It simply follows the noise." Larry and Emil, neither heroes nor monsters history, often simplifies criminals into two categories, heroes or villains. But Larry and Emil were neither. They were not heroes. Their actions were reckless, destructive, selfish, and deadly. But they were also not mythical monsters, not masterminds, not geniuses, not revolutionaries. They were two flawed men with fragile egos, misguided anger, and fantasies they mistook for destiny. They died chasing a war they created themselves, and their story stands as a warning. When anger becomes identity, when violence becomes purpose, when fantasy becomes reality, the result is always tragedy. The legacy of February the 28th. 20 years later, people still visit the intersection of Laurel Canyon and Archwood to stare at the spot where the shootout happened, not to glorify the robbers, not to relive the violence, but to remember how fragile safety can be, how unpredictable life truly is, how ordinary mornings can turn extraordinary in a single moment, and to remember the courage of those who stood in the line of fire. A plaque doesn't mark the site. There is no memorial, no tourist guide, but the people who lived through it don't need one. For them, February 28, 1997, is carved into memory, deeper than any bullet mark. Closing words. The day violence challenged a city. The North Hollywood shootout was not just a robbery, not just a shootout, not just a crime. It was a moment when fear and courage collided, when two men tried to overpower a city and failed, when ordinary officers faced extraordinary danger and held the line, when live television confronted viewers with the terrifying reality that danger can erupt anywhere at any time. It was a day when Los Angeles was tested, a day when the world watched in disbelief, a day that reshaped modern policing, and as the smoke faded, the city learned a lesson that still echoes today. Evil doesn't always arrive wearing a villain's mask. Sometimes it arrives looking like two ordinary men who believed they were invincible. Their war ended on a Los Angeles street, but the impact of that day ripples through history still.